So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Keating. I've been brought in at the last minute to moderate this panel because, unfortunately, the moderator, Hans, is unwell, as is, unfortunately, one of the speakers, Sheri Berman. But we have an absolutely cracking panel with us today. Their biographies are in the little pamphlet here, with the exception of Heather Graby's, because she has also been volunteered to participate. And Heather is the director of the Open Society Policy Institute, based in Brussels, like me. Suzanne Nossel is the chief executive officer at PEN America. And Stephen runs a global philanthropic foundation focusing on governance issues. And the topic before us, as I'm sure you all know, is reinvigorating and renewing democracy. And we meet, of course, at a time when the January the 6th hearings are taking place in the US, at a time when the fallout from the French elections are still reverberating, and lots of fairly significant elections have taken place in the last couple of weeks and months, and many coming down the track. Just before we get into the issues, I think you all know this is on the record. We have quite a number of people online, as well as in the room. What strikes me about the description of this session is that we're going to focus on ideas for revitalizing the systems and practice of democracy. And it seems to me there's an assumption being made here, which is that the systems and practice of democracy are not in good shape. There is something wrong going on. And one of the things I'm going to ask everyone to react to is whether they believe indeed that is the case. And what we will do, 3 to 5 minutes each from the panelists, and then I'm going to open the floor, the session up to questions from the floor, as well as to people online, and then get a discussion going. But just before we start, there are a couple of things that you could or could not use to frame your 3 to 5 minute remarks. But it strikes me that the kind of things that I would be very interested in knowing, other than some cracking ideas as to how we're going to strengthen democracy at the end of our session, is what you consider the biggest threats to democracy to be at the moment, how you would rate elections as a means of ensuring democratic accountability, and whether and how that is changing, and if there is a problem there, what can be done about that. And if you do believe that democracy is fraying for one reason or another, why is that? And to what degree is it the result of dynamics in democratic countries themselves? To what degree is it more to do with global trends and loss of confidence in the ability of people who emerge through democratic processes to deal with the kind of problems we're facing? And if it's both, what are the connections between these two things? And I have to say, this is not my area of expertise, but I did look at what the Economist Intelligence Unit Democracy Index, is that considered to be a credible source of information, is saying about the progress of democracy. And they are saying that negative trends are continuing. Mm-hmm. There are a few exceptions to that, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe. But on the whole, the situation worldwide, using their metrics, is not looking good. So, on that basis, Heather, do you want to kick us off with your your thoughts on some of these issues.
Thanks very much. Well, there's a lot we can discuss, and I think particularly this issue of domestic versus international factors in democracy is an important one. So I just want to highlight three major trends internationally which are affecting democracy, which relate to previous sessions that we've had today. We've had a lot of food for thought. Just linking these things up can be helpful. One is the global nature of many of the crises facing governments, and how difficult it is for governments to take agency and to reassure their citizens that they actually have control of the situation. Because the truth is, they don't. You know, there's a certain amount they can do globally within their own country on, for example, the pandemic. But in terms of inflation, certainly in terms of climate change, global economic trends, now potentially global food crisis, the old idea that you can have socialism in one country or a one-country response to many challenges is simply no longer the case. Because of globalization, which has actually removed agency and power from governments, and which has made citizens see how helpless their governments are, the limits, the very strong limits on what national governments can do. And yet, national governments and elections of national governments remain the primary unit, the primary level of democracy. And it's actually very difficult to get beyond that. And I think once we come to talk about democratic innovation, and you already mentioned, Michael, this idea of can we get beyond elections, it's really important to remember how much democracy gets used to elections as the part of the democratic system that citizens know best, can understand best, but which is no longer delivering often the choices that they would like to make. Now, that's partly because of the global transnational nature of many of the threats and many of the trends. It's also because of the convergence of mainstream parties on economic policy towards the center, where you've only got populists and extremes offering an alternative to a basic neoliberal model, sometimes more social market economy, sometimes less state interventionism, but certainly in established democracies in North America and in Europe, and indeed in a number of other places, there's not really a big alternative. Now, all of this matters greatly if we think about a big challenge we've been talking about a lot today at this conference, which is climate change, the energy transition, and the major system change that is coming that we will have to have in order to cope with the changing climate and environmental crises that are about to hit us. This really poses an enormous challenge to representative democracy as it has evolved since the 19th century, to the regular cycle of elections every 4 or 5 years at which people choose between competing parties, often presenting different policy options, and where they can change that government every 4 or 5 years if they don't like what they get. And the problem with climate change is it's actually a several decades-long transition that needs very consistent policies, very consistent signals to markets and to investors so that the capital goes in the right direction to make the changes necessary, that requires big government public infrastructure investment and other forms of capital investment by the public sector, which also has to span several governments in terms of commitments. And so the idea that people can just kick the bastards out if they don't like what they've done. This doesn't work very well when you're trying to do a major system change. So that's the time frame problem for climate and democracy. Then there's a territory problem. At the most basic level, there is only one climate. It's impossible for any one government to deliver a climate strategy on its own. We heard Kwasi Kwarteng this morning talking about all the things the British government is doing, most of which actually require collaboration with neighbours who happen to be in the European Union, and most of which also involve some form of broader multilateral cooperation. So it's actually very difficult to have a one-country climate policy. And the need to reach out to others and to forge transnational and multi-level and multilateral coalitions is pretty unwelcome in countries where strongmen leaders want to come in and argue, I'm going to take control and tell the people, I reassure you that this is not going to affect you. That's also very difficult to arrange. So you've got a time frame problem, you've got a territory problem, and then you've got a policy choice problem because these are very complex trade-offs that are needed. okay, we've got an energy crisis now where we want to get off the Russian gas. So is it better to burn more coal and increase our carbon emissions in the short term, or to build new infrastructure that will continue gas, which produces fewer emissions immediately, but locks us into an infrastructure that will keep us on fossil fuels for longer? How do you make that trade-off? And how do you present that to the public and invite them to weigh in on this when they only get a chance every 4 or 5 years to make one choice for one party? This is also very tricky, also when you have mass parties. So I just leave you with 2 ideas about methods of enriching democracy, complementing representative democracy, because I think it's very hard to replace it completely. You know, as Churchill famously said, democracy is the worst form of governance, apart from all the others we've tried time to time. We don't actually have another model. But to enhance democracy, there are now a number of innovations that have been tried out and which offer new opportunities that are especially important in managing the politics of the climate transition. One is climate assemblies, through various forms of citizen engagement, especially at city level, which involve a great deal of deliberation. Now, deliberation is really important when you've got highly complex issues on which you wouldn't want to have something as blunt as a referendum, and where there needs to be a lot of explanation of the issues, and then people can actually make very good informed choices, and where you need a lot of feedback from the public about how this is affecting their daily lives. So it's a two-way pedagogical process. So I think it's very helpful, but it does have to be a complement, and I think it could be a lot better than having a series of, the nightmare scenario is polarized parties, some of whom are offering impossible or unreal supposed solutions on climate, slugging it out every 4 or 5 years, and massive changes in policy and investment every 4 or 5 years. Far better to have also a plethora of initiatives where citizens can have their say, can be involved, can understand the trade-offs, and can also weigh in on what will be, I think, a quite decentralized transition.
Fantastic. So, you know, we are hostage to electoral cycles to deal with issues that don't lend themselves to electoral cycles, and we're trying to deal with global problems through national structures. On your point about citizens' assemblies, I'm going to come back to you. How do you make sure that these then get political traction? Because it's one thing to do them and come up with fabulous results that represent, you know, informed public opinion, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily going to translate into policy. Suzanne, love to hear from you, and you have got to at some point refer to the January the 6th hearings and whether you think this is a means of revitalizing democracy, or, you know, what's going on there. Over to you.
Sure. So I think of what's ailing democracies as kind of a 4-part matrix. If you imagine across the top of a chart, challenges and enemies, and along the side, rows labeled internal and external. So the 4 categories of ills are internal and external challenges, internal and external enemies. So internal challenges are forces like income inequality, underdevelopment, corruption, political sclerosis that corrupt democracy from the inside, with disaffection and indifference settling in, and populations becoming alienated with democratic institutions and leaders who don't seem to be able to address these scourges. Compounding the pressures are the withering of local news outlets, the rise of hyper-partisan media, and the fragmentation of the digital universe. So none of these developments are an intentional, willful campaign to thwart democracy, but nonetheless, they burrow away at its foundations. The external challenges, things like refugee flows, pandemics, climate change that cross borders and stress the system. They're organic forces rather than deliberate assaults on democracy. Some, like COVID or climate, are equal opportunity threats that can challenge autocracies perhaps just as much. These are not intentional, masterminded campaigns to subvert democracy, but rather tectonic shifts that deepen tensions, sow doubts, and can exacerbate existing pressure points. The enemies of democracy are characterized by a deliberate design to undermine open, representative, rights-respecting systems and a determination to replace them with alternative power structures. And I think this is something that, you know, at least in our time, is relatively new or has intensified drastically. Internal enemies, you know, for us in the United States and around the world, including extremists, homegrown authoritarians, conspiracists, and corrupt self-dealers, put personal and partisan gain ahead of democratic norms. External enemies, authoritarian aggressors who cross borders to work their will, of course, Putin in Ukraine, Beijing's usurpation of Hong Kong's partial democracy, and its menacing of Taiwan. External enemies have also begun to penetrate inside democracies that are outside of their geographic and political reach. Russian propaganda pushed in an effort to tilt U.S. and European elections, and China exerting rising influence on university campuses and media organizations worldwide. So those four compartments, if you can imagine them, unfortunately are not watertight. They interact in what has become something of a perfect storm. External enemies of democracy play off domestic fault lines. The authoritarian playbook has now, I think, been translated into all languages with copycat tactics such as labeling credible journalism fake news and micro-targeting on social media for political ends. Malaise and disaffection born of the challenges of democracy serve to embolden its enemies, creating a crisis of confidence that can be mutually reinforcing. But I know the aim of this panel was not just to describe the problems, but also think about solutions and where we see hope. And there is no silver bullet to all of this. And for me as an American, witnessing the corrosion of our own democracy in my time has been, and I think for many of us, shocking, something we never thought we would see or witness. I do think that ultimately, while the threats and challenges come from, enemies and challenges come from without and within, that the fate of democracy will be determined from within. The body politic has to heal and strengthen itself. It's not a task that any foreign power, multilateral institution, or global civil society campaign from the outside can accomplish. A few specific thoughts on the discrete pain points. When it comes to challenges from within, these are mostly things that have intensified over decades and will take years and even maybe generations to remedy. In the United States, we need to rebuild civic education for our children, inoculate them against disinformation, but meanwhile, our schools have turned into ideological battlegrounds over book and curriculum bans. And yet, it's in the here and now that we face a crisis of faith that if we don't stanch, will make the task of democratic revival much harder going forward. So I think ultimately we need to buy time. The best we can do is expose the enemies and energize the natural allies. I'll get to exposing the enemies in a minute, but I want to say a little bit about energizing the natural allies of democracy. I think part of that is just showing that the system can work. I think President Biden was trying to do that with his Build Back Better legislation to show that democracy could reform itself. That was thwarted. I think even this small gun control measure that hopefully will go through, maybe even as soon as today in the United States Congress, may be an illustration that the system, this broken system can work sort of for once. I think we need a campaign of civic invigoration. Patriotism in our country has sort of gotten a bad name, and it's the confluence of these forces with the reckoning over inequality that pervades our society. But I think we have to find ways and means to promote and celebrate what makes democracies the world's best system. I think people have lost sight of that. It needs to happen in the schools, in the streets. It can be a counterweight to COVID-era atomization and isolation. Maybe it's partly linked to the 250th anniversary of the United States of 1776, 4 years from now. And I think it can't be just the work of politicians. It has to cut across culture, the arts, media, music, and entertainment to remind us what we treasure about our societies is rooted in openness, protections for individual rights, and checks and balances. Challenges from without know no borders and have to be managed transnationally with democracies and autocracies alike. Democracies have a powerful stake in the international system of multilateral institutions and infrastructure, UN bodies, treaty fora. These structures were designed by democracies with democratic principles, albeit very imperfectly embedded in them. They need to be defended against attempts to hollow out their founding principles and rescued from desuetude. We could not stand those structures up again now if we tried. We could never get those treaties passed and adopted. So in my view, we can't allow political differences to stand in the way of cooperation in areas that are existential to the future of democracy. And many of these transnational, external challenges to democracy meet that criteria. Talking about enemies from within poses a particular dilemma for democratic systems. Safeguards designed to protect against retaliation and muzzling of political opponents make it hard to go after those who take aim at the system itself. And that's really what the January 6th hearings are doing, is trying to, in a very measured, nonpartisan way, to expose objectively this unprecedented assault on our system. It's factually grounded, it's meticulous. Most of the voices are Republicans, highly respected Republican officials. And I think it's potentially a very important strategy. As Americans, we've gotten very leery of putting faith in these efforts because we've seen time and again that it doesn't change enough minds to sort of reverse the political tide. But I do see these hearings are getting a lot of attention, they're sparking a lot of debate, and if they move just a small segment in the middle, that could be decisive. And then finally, just to wrap up, in terms of enemies from without, I think these need a concerted multilateral strategy. I think there's an effort at democratic solidarity that we see at work in Ukraine, countries coming together, not to promote democracy necessarily or make the world safe for democracy, but really to defend democracy and to come together to fight against these external enemies. And I think common cause must be made not just among democratic countries, but also with Democrats, with individuals, wherever they live, whether they're in exile, whether they're working within an authoritarian society or a backsliding democracy, but who represent the green shoots, the seeds of democratic futures.
Well, I think that is a very important point to end on, that Democrats exist everywhere, including in autocratic countries, and raises the issue as whether there's another Russia, for example. But I mean, two things I take away from, I take away so much from what you said, but two things strike me in particular. One is the linkages and the feedback loops between the internal and external dynamics. And some people think that Putin may be using migration as a tool deliberately to polarize politics in Europe and other democracies, knowing what that does to the credibility of democracy. And that's a very chilling thought. May come back to you on that. The other thing, expose the enemies and energize the allies. And I hope that January the 6th hearings contributes to that as one part of it. The question I would have for you is whether that's then going to result in systems change, or whether it's just going to result in even more cynicism, about politics and democratic systems. So, Stephen, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Michael. You mentioned the Economist report at the beginning, and I think there are many reports which talk about the backsliding of democracy and people's lack of faith in democracy. Just to quote another one, the Bennett Institute at the University of Cambridge last year produced a global report on satisfaction with democracy, which showed that satisfaction with democracy had declined or had increased to 70% across the countries which they polled, from 50% a decade earlier. And where there was satisfaction with democracy is in what they call the islands of contentment, places where democracy worked, where there was faith in institutions, where there was a sense that the state actually did its job properly. Inevitably, that will be Denmark, Switzerland, Luxembourg, places like that. Where there was dissatisfaction with democracy is obviously in the larger democratic countries like Mexico, like Brazil, the UK, the US, and so on, where we have a much more sort of complex picture of societal conflict, and where institutions are being hollowed out and they're not able to serve the public and the populations in the way that they had done previously. We've also done some research at Luminate, the foundation which I run, in Latin America, which paints a slightly different picture. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was whether there is a generational divide as well. What we did some qualitative interviews with 16 to 24-year-olds across Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia. And it was really interesting. What we found is that there was a great dissatisfaction with the institutions of democracy, but a real passion for the values of democracy. And in answer to your question, Michael, about elections, is that young people happy to vote, and they saw that elections were a viable and legitimate way of kicking out old leaders, bringing in new leaders, and so on. But what they felt, without exception, was that the democratic processes and institutions didn't work for them, didn't recognize their needs. And also, they were getting their information in very different ways. We've just seen the Colombian election where you've seen Rodolfo Hernandez, who was the losing candidate, who was called the TikTok king. The way in which he was campaigning was almost exclusively on TikTok. And what we're seeing, I think, is a generational difference in the way in which people consume information. That's nothing new. We've talked about that a lot over the course of today. But I think when it comes to democratic values, there is some hope, I think, amongst younger people, particularly in the countries in which we surveyed. There is they see it in terms of individual freedom, the ability and the wish to have freedom of identity. The big interest, for example, around LGBTQI communities, underrepresented groups feeling for the first time that they have the ability to access power. And that is something, I think, that gives us cause for hope. And I think we shouldn't be too concerned about the sort of doomsday scenarios that are posted by these sort of more quantitative aggregation of polls which we've seen. A second point I wanted to make really was around, and I think Suzanne, you'd mentioned this as well, which is about the personalization of politics. And I think one of the big threats, of course, and we've talked about this again in a number of sessions today, and as Gideon Rachman spoke about this morning, the age of the strongman, which has really built in momentum over the last 20 years. And it's a pattern which is quite familiar. Somebody is voted in, Erdogan or Putin, perhaps in imperfect electoral process, but then spends the rest of their time hollowing out the institutions which would normally impose some control and restraint on their ability to make their own laws, to develop their own webs of patronage and so on. And I think this is a phenomenon that is not just in the US with Trump, it's not just in Russia. We're seeing this in Brazil with Bolsonaro. We're seeing this on the right and on the left as well. There's, I think, some enthusiasm about the election of Gustavo Petro in Colombia. But if you look at what happened with AMLO in Mexico, is that very quickly that sort of more popular election mandate that had bound people together and which gave people hope and inspiration quickly became, there were signs of authoritarian rule which was creeping in, and we've seen that certainly in Mexico. The other thing I think that Suzanne, you also mentioned as well, which I think is worth repeating, is that the strong men are using the sort of politics of fear and are exaggerating fear. Actually, they don't really exist. We've seen this in Europe, in Hungary, of course, with Berman, with this kind of idea that there are migrants at Hungary's borders which are going to overwhelm their society and so on. That's not the case. I think Hungary had taken in a couple of hundred migrants in 2015 and 2016. But this kind of idea of exaggeration and overstating the fears, I think, is something that also plays to that strongman version of politics. Two final points. One is around the failure of the information ecosystem. People are now faced with massive choice about how they consume information. And we've seen, I think, very worrying trends happening with election interference through social media, and also the way in which politicians have used social media to amplify hate and to spread misinformation and disinformation. If we think about the narrative on Ukraine, the Ukrainians have won the English information narrative war, but the Russians are doing very, very well in other parts of the world, in different languages and so on. We've been tracking Russian misinformation in Eastern Central Europe, and there's real evidence that in Bulgarian, in Romanian, and in the Western Balkans, in those languages, the Russian narrative is sticking and is getting through. Facebook, Meta, and other platforms have spent a lot of time on content moderation around English but they spent very little time looking at other languages. And we've seen this, of course, in the past with the hate speech in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, and so on. So there's a lot of focus on the English language. We mustn't ignore the fact that Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms are operating in many other languages, and they have a greater traction. Finally, I think there is also a disconnect, perhaps, between a kind of US and European vision of democracy and elsewhere. And this is somewhat related to the narrative around the Ukraine and Russian war. There is a relationship, I think, between domestic enthusiasm for democracy and the role, particularly in the US and EU, in promoting and protecting democracy worldwide. Arguably, public fatigue, I think, in opposition to the war in Afghanistan and the botched evacuation last August emboldened Putin in his thoughts about whether the West was weak, whether it wouldn't be interested in engaging in sort of international scenarios as well. If Trump is elected in 2024 or re-elected, the commitment to NATO is under threat. He's already spoken quite openly about redirecting military support to Ukraine back to US domestic issues as well. I think, finally, the narrative, as I said, and a number of people had mentioned this earlier in other sessions, around Ukraine is very different depending on where you're sitting. If you're looking at English language social media and you're based in Europe or the US, you think everybody is on board. If you're in Africa, if you're in Brazil, if you're in India, the narrative is very different. And it's also tinged, I think, with some of the kind of hypocrisy of previous regime change sort of activities, of course, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and also, I think, a sense that in some countries, the welcome that's given to Ukrainians in Europe is very different from the welcome that's given to other migrants from other parts of the world as well. I'll stop there.
Great. Well, I'm going to open the floor up, but I just want to react. I mean, I think the point that, in a way, everybody's made is that no one is saying that elections are not a good idea, but they're not enough, right? I think that's what we're saying. And I have been in a number of situations where people are voting for the very first time in their lives, and it's such a powerful feeling where that happens. Secondly, you talk about young people. Very interesting about the survey you did in these Latin American countries. But if I'm not mistaken, young people's engagement in elections in many other countries is going down, including here, I believe, in the recent French elections. So what's going on there? I mean, if young people are energized, is this something to do with, I don't know, the maturity of democracies or the cynicism of the politicians? And the third one, you mentioned strongmen usurping democracy and in a way using elections as a vehicle for pursuing a nefarious agenda. And that's quite scary because it means that elections, I think if you're saying, are becoming a sort of distraction from what's really going on. And you mentioned particularly Facebook and Twitter, and I do wonder what the reaction to that should be. Should it be that people are promoting democracy should be even better than the autocrats at using these instruments, or is it about trying to change the systems themselves? Is it about going back to the companies that are doing this and trying to get systems change, or is it just beating autocrats at their own game? But sorry, I've asked lots of questions, but let me ask, how am I going to do this? Lots of hands. I'm going to start with the lady in red at the back, and then this gentleman here, and then this gentleman here, and then that one there, and then we'll see where that takes us. Please, could you just mention who you are, and if you can, be succinct and ask your questions so that we can fit everybody else in. Thank you.
Claudia Hamill, European Forum for Manufacturing, amongst others, and also a member of Chatham House. Building up on what you panelists have said, and Stephen in particular, how do you think that social media, does it facilitate or inhibit current models of democracy, and has it got any role to play in creating new ones?
Thank you. Gentleman here.
Thank you very much. My name is Arthur Corbin-Powells. I'm the founder of Project Ukraine, so I've been studying Russian propaganda for quite some time, and it's really dangerous. But may I just say, Putin isn't a strong man. He was put in as a weak man. He grabbed the levers of power to create, and by the way, fooled the West that he's a strong man. So that's a terrible problem, but we have an even bigger one. I think the issues raised are great, but AI is something I've been studying even more. AI and democracy in the limit could quite be incomparable. They probably don't really glide. China might be a giant AI with vestiges called people reverberating. Do we address AI right now, and if so, how do we do it? Time to regulate it. I see. So AI and democracy are not good bedfellows. I can't remember the next hand I agreed to. Was it you, sir? Yeah, this gentleman here. There's two. Both of them have white shirts. Shout, yeah. Except we have people online, so it'd be quite useful if...
Should Western political... Sorry, Lee Solomons from the British Government Cabinet Office. Should Western political leaders speak publicly about these threats to democracy? Would that be a useful rallying cry or a useless ideological concession? Thank you.
Wow, okay. And the gentleman here.
Yes. My name is Mohammed Tantoush. I'm a Chatham House member with the Libyan embassy. So my question is, giving like an example of Libya, of course, as usual. So in post-conflict countries, should always be the trend of the United Nations or the international community to push for elections before solving the more conflict issues, which is like deeper issues, as usual.
Yeah.
Because this is what the announcement is doing in Libya, like for 10 years, and they are like totally failed.
So you're basically asking, can elections be conflict multipliers rather than conflict resolution things? Should we take a couple more and then, or are you kind of saturated in questions? Can we?
I don't know. I would say maybe tackle those.
Tackle those first. So, Suzanne, you're clearly ready. So can everyone choose which ones they want, and then I'll see which ones haven't been answered and pick one of you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll pick one, which is the social media one, because I'm also part of the Facebook Oversight Board. So I do think about these very thorny questions about the interplay of social media and democracy. You know, my feeling is social media weaponizes human nature, and it sort of takes, you know, those aspects that are most innate to us and plays on our passions and our, you know, our best instincts to connect with people and show our approval and, you know, boost people up, you know, on happy occasions, and our worst instincts to balkanize and point fingers and indulge in conspiracy theories. And it is very hard, I think, technologically to separate, you know, those aspects of the platform that, you know, are what people thrive on and enjoy from those that are so pernicious. I also don't think it's a genie that can go back into a bottle. You know, people talk about in the States about the role of Craigslist and Craig Newmark in the demise of Lone News, and it's true. You know, he's become a great philanthropist trying to sort of, you know, in a sense compensate for that, but the marketplace that he created was going to emerge anyway, you know, whether he had established it or not. And so, you know, where I think we are left is really to experiment and play, you know, play around with these dials of how can we, you know, to your point, you know, they have gotten better at controlling disinformation, particularly, you know, it was exemplified during COVID, you know, in English. You know, they were not just suppressing false information and quackery, but also elevating credible sources of information. But, you know, for financial and revenue reasons, that effort has been overwhelmingly channeled toward the English-speaking world, whereas the consequences of these platforms in the rest of the world are even more extreme because the internet utilization patterns are different, and you know, in a place like Myanmar, Facebook basically practically is the internet. So no easy answers, but I think it's a crucial area.
Heather.
Just to add one point on that, the other thing about social media that it can do, which elections can't, is to offer interaction and personal engagement. And so that's why, as a means of communication, as Suzanne was just pointing out, it has its particularities, but it's very hard to compete with that kind of engagement. And especially when that engagement is actually fake, when it's not with real people, it's with bots. And I think that links to the AI question, because I think one of the most dangerous parts parts of AI and democracy is the way that it's now possible to, that you can have the power of artificial intelligence to put out narratives which are then perfectly tailored at a very individual level to the user, to that particular Facebook page, that particular account, where they're not only in the language, they may in fact be generated by Russia Today or by Sputnik, but they appear in Spanish or in Arabic, and then they're tailored to that individual because it's possible to do that in an automated system. And that's where I think the regulation needs to go next, and where we can't actually only rely on the platforms to do that regulation themselves. At the moment, that's what's going on. So, and this is where I think, what's just happened at EU level with the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, has got some really groundbreaking new measures, which it's important to see whether they can be made to work. But I wanted to come to this question about, should leaders speak publicly about the threats? Yes, they should, because of something that Stephen mentioned earlier, which is that people still value democratic values. They still want them, but they don't get it that they need institutions to protect and foster those values. And not seeing the connection between the values and the institutions, that connection that leaders need to talk about, because that's the only way to root those institutions deeply into society. So it's harder for a strongman leader to come into power and hollow them out. And we saw with Trump how easy it was, actually, for him to hollow out certain institutions because the American public didn't really know what they were for and what they did, so there was no outcry. Now, you see the way that some institutions are deeply valued, think about the Bundesbank or indeed the Constitutional Court in Germany, because they are answers to great fears about past traumas, about inflation, hyperinflation, and about taking over the body politic. But we see in a lot of countries, democracies that have the panoply of institutions, the seeming infrastructure, but it's not really understood or valued by the public, so that then when a strongman leader like Orban comes in and takes them over and simply fills them with his own loyalists, there are protests for a little while, but then it goes away. The peace government has been trying to do the same thing in Poland. So, even inside the European Union, this can happen. So it can happen in any democracy. And I think that need for institutions perhaps will never be loved, but their role and the importance that they have in protecting the values needs to be much better understood. And this is where I think leaders also need to do something that does not come naturally to them, which is to explain why they, as political leaders, should not have control over these institutions. Right. So the separation of powers and checks and balances has rather fallen out of favor in countries where executives would love to have more control of the legislature, this country, for example, or executives would love to have more control of the judiciary. We saw this, Trump achieved that with the Supreme Court. And definitely we see this in Hungary and Poland. But to stand up and protect checks and balances by saying, well, when I'm out of power, I want to make sure those institutions are still serving me as a citizen or as an opposition politician, that story is not being told often enough.
Great. Now, Stephen, you can answer anything you want, but there is one question unanswered. This is about elections in conflict countries. I don't know if you want to deal with that one, but you may want to go somewhere else. Go ahead. And by the way, we've got tons more questions, both online and on the floor, so I'm really keen to get back to everybody.
Yeah, I think the danger is if you say, let's leave elections until we have stability and we have development, you've got Rwanda. Is that, you'll find ways in which elections, or Uganda, you'll find ways in which elections then become unnecessary. Right. So there's always an excuse to, let's defer elections until later. Let's defer elections until there isn't, storms. Let's, defer elections until everyone's rich. So I think that, I'm a great fan of elections. I think we should have them. If nothing else, to sort of get that regular reappraisal and give people the opportunity to feel that they are participating in the democratic process. There's very few opportunities that people have. I think what you said, Heather, earlier on, I think is really worth exploring, is this kind of in-between elections, what are the opportunities for people to make decisions? I'm a big advocate of lowering the voting age as well. I think people actually, 16-year-olds can make decisions. on things. I know David Runciman thinks 6 is the appropriate age, but I think I'm a little higher than that. Just on social media, I agree, Suzanne, that the genie is out of the bottle. We can't do anything about it, and there's no sort of vision in the world where you say Facebook doesn't exist or Twitter doesn't exist, because there will be a replacement for it. It is also a useful platform for many people, and as you said, in Myanmar, Facebook is the internet. In many other countries, it's a way of delivering public services. It's a way of actually soliciting information. Where I do feel there's a problem is the business model of social media platforms is there to amplify hate. And it serves up, the business model goes on amplification and clicks. And so if you're saying something controversial, the algorithms will amplify that. It's like being in a town square, and in previous times somebody could be shouting, like on the Hyde Park corner, Speaker's Corner, and saying the most terrible things, but they wouldn't actually spread very far. What social media does is give them a microphone and a loudspeaker, and then also crowds everybody else in who may be susceptible to those kind of views. And that is where it is destructive and where it fuels hate. So there has to be regulation. I agree with Heather. We can't leave it to the platforms to regulate, and I think there's a lot of moves in the EU at the moment, not in the US, to try and impose more regulation. And I think that's going to come whether we like it or not, or whether Facebook likes it or not, I should say. In answer to your question about should Western leaders speak out, they should. I think the trouble is it's who speaks and what they say and on what channels. The mentioned earlier on from Latin America is there is a massive distrust of career politicians, and where they get their information from and who they listen to is influencers on TikTok. Right. If you can get influencers on TikTok to talk about how good democracy is, that's far better than getting Boris Johnson to do it.
Why do you? Can I go back to the question I asked you about young people in some places and not in others, cynical about elections?
Sorry, why would...
You said in Latin America, young people are very enthusiastic about elections, and yet we see...
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would posit, although I don't have the evidence, that, there are pockets of enthusiasm in many other parts of the world. I mean, I think Heather and I were just talking before the session, that in Europe there is also evidence that people get interested in things like climate change, they get interested in identity politics, they get interested in causes, and that gives them an entry point into civic and political life. Right. One of the things we're funding as an organization in Nigeria is a group called Run to Win, which focuses on young women and gives them the skills and the ability to run for office for the first time. We're doing the same in Colombia and so on.
Right. I'm just going to mention a couple of things online and then turn to the floor. One is a comment more than anything else with Xi and Putin. This is from Patrick Flynn, seeking extended terms and a no limit and having a no limit partnership. Surely there are questions over the persistence of solidarity of Western allies as administrations change. And I think we've kind of addressed that, but I guess, does the change of administrations undermine a serious international campaign by democracies to push back on autocratic challenge to democracy? And then Joe Cole asks, to what extent would electoral system reform re-engage voter participation in democracies? Let me take some questions from the floor. I'm going to take 4. One there, that lady there, this gentleman there, and then there was somebody who's very persistent. Where is he? That gentleman there. So, lady over here, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Melanie Avila. I'm Chatham House staff and also a citizen of Argentina and Brazil. So my question goes directly to Stephen, actually, because I find the qualitative study that you've carried out at Luminate quite interesting. Seeing the youth's increasing lack of confidence in democratic institutions, what has been the role of judicial reform as an engine for the youth's political participation? And how can we realistically remedy the breach between the concept of democratic values and the execution of democratic processes in Latin America?
Got that?
No.
No. Could you say it again? Just the crucial question at the end.
The crucial question is...
Democratic values.
Hello, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Better.
How can we realistically remedy the breach between the concept of democratic values and the execution of democratic processes in Latin America, seeing that the youth the youth's confidence in institutions is decreasing every day.
Okay, so we take, have you got that one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, was it the gentleman here? Yes?
Hello, Mark Lodge from the International Network for Cancer Treatment and Research. You talked about hollowing out of democracy. Has this been, does the panel think that this has been done by parliamentary governments who've decided through ideology to give more influence to the private sector and diminish the state?
I think that's, yeah, any of you could answer. And then there was the gentleman here in the blue shirt, and then I will come to you, sir, and then that's it.
Semir Gürsel, Chatham House member. My question in democracy, last century, we saw the fight to establish democracy. This century, not even a quarter of the century gone by yet, we are seeing the death of democracy by the elected people. Now, the word itself, democracy, is it going now forever? Because the title says reinvigorating and renewing democracy, which means we're trying to really resuscitate democracy, which in my view is dead, Now, in relation to...
What's your question, sir?
The question is, elections are supposed to be democratic.
Yes.
But how can it be democratic when you are elected, deselected? Thank you.
I see. Okay, thank you. And final question here in the front, please. Yep, it's there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nicholas Dungan from Cogito Praxis. Michael, you said elections are not enough. You were speaking about what happens between elections. What happens between elections, in fact, democracy is not only about politics, it's not only about institutions, it's about the behavior of individual citizens every day in society. I'm chairing a breakfast roundtable tomorrow morning on corporate citizenship here. And you've all addressed different bits of the private sector. And Heather, you talked about citizens' assemblies. Now, the private sector is not just civil society, not-for-profits, but I'd like it if you could, so you've addressed all that implicitly, and I wonder if you could address explicitly how you think civil society, the private sector, companies, everybody who is not the state, non-state actors within countries and between countries affects democracy. Thank you.
Right. I've been told that in 9 minutes we are going to be competing with the caterers in this room. So we have precisely 9 minutes to answer these very rich questions. So I'm going to, you know, you're an ill-disciplined lot. So I'm going to ask you...
See, blame the citizen,
yes.
not the leader.
You have something like 90 seconds each to choose the questions to which you want to answer. I'm saying 90 seconds because I know you're going to take more. But 90 seconds. Who wants to go first? There was a question directed at you, Stephen. So do you want to kick off with that one?
Yes, and apologies, I couldn't quite hear, but I think the gist of your question, and please correct me if I'm wrong, was that younger people are disillusioned about the institutions and feel that they're not working for them, and what do we need to do to strengthen those institutions or make them more relevant? Is that correct, or have I?
So, yeah.
Okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is about getting younger people to run for office and also to be part of those institutions. So, you know, as I've mentioned before, you know, in Nigeria we've supported young women to do that exactly. In Colombia, we've supported a group of 18 to 20-year-olds to basically run for local office, recognizing that people, you know, sometimes there are restrictions on what age you can be to run as an MP or as an elected representative. And I think getting that experience of whether it's local government or, you know, youth councils and so on, we've seen demonstrated that this gives people an appetite for greater participation. I think there's also, you know, beyond just running for elected office, there are many other ways in which people can play leadership roles. And I think that's part of it as well. And in Latin America, we've certainly found that that's an entry point into restoring faith in those institutions.
Any other question you want to answer in 30 seconds? 30 seconds.
No, I'll leave it to
Okay,
Suzanne.
Suzanne.
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly on that point, I think there's a difference between youth sort of having an appetite for voice and influence and having faith in democratic institutions. And I think the kinds of initiatives that you're talking about actually get people plugged into institutions, running for office, educated about what these institutions do, how they can have an influence, how they can participate is extremely important. We see in the United States very often among young people the values of equality and inclusion, which are extremely important to young people, pitted against freedom of speech, that they don't understand how freedom of speech underwrites their ability to go out in the streets and protest. And so when you explain it, they do get it, but that linkage it can be lost. I'll just take up the point about sort of corporate influence, which is, I think, extremely important. I mean, in our country, our failure to rein in the role of corporations in influencing campaigns, I think, is a major driver of the loss of faith in our democratic systems. Our legislators are beholden to corporate interests. They spend inordinate amounts of time raising money. In Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives, they have to run for office every 2 years. And so it's a monumental distraction and depletion and diffusion of effort, and it also, puts corporations in the position of, it's almost they wouldn't be representing their shareholder interests if they were not engaged in powerful lobbying operations in Washington. I agree in the social media realm, we need regulation. We need to continue to experiment. We need to push back against, what has become, in many instances, kind of a version of capture.
Mm-hmm.
So
and you have to answer my question too, Heather, about traction of all these supplementary systems for buttressing democracy.
Yes, okay. Yes. Okay, I will do that. So first of all, just the flip side, I agree with you, Suzanne, you're absolutely right. And this is where I think, limits on party funding are incredibly important. We could have a whole session on that. But the flip side of it is this very interesting debate that's been growing about what is the social responsibility of private capital and of companies. And the way that, and I think, you Nicholas, came onto this as well, how much that's part of the substantive part of democracy. We have the procedural side, elections and the like we were talking about. The substantive side also involves the private sector and civil society and so on, because ultimately democracy is about the choices, about the collective good. What is the collective good? How to achieve it? Who decides? And also, the ways how to implement it, how to fund it, how to make it happen through institutions, and so on. And that needs a very wide debate, which you can't reduce simply to the ballot box. And that involves the whole of society. But what's interesting about this debate about what's not just corporate social responsibility, but the ultimate purpose of the private sector, the idea it's not just making profits is not enough, and the rise and now slight, blip in ESG, it's been reduced to compliance issues and risk issues. But actually, it's about something much more fundamental, which is what are companies for? Companies are a form of organization which are supposed to achieve some kind of social good in the same way as other institutions. And so how that's decided, how that's regulated, we're having a new debate about that, which I think is encouraging for democracy, that it's not just the old debates about how much state intervention should there be, how much should it be about the private sector doing things. It's also about, okay, so what's the role of all of these institutions? So I think that's actually a really valuable thing, which helps to bring in voters to talk about these substantive issues as well. But just to come back to your point, Michael, about, how do we enhance democracy? What's the role of all these things? It's to engage citizens on decisions about their own future in an age when mass parties no longer represent mass interests. We had, after the Second World War in Europe and the United States, a system in which you had mass parties representing the workers and industry. You typically then had a party that represented more rural areas, farmers, landowners, and then you had other forms around that. But you had the big parties, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and so on. This is broken down to an extraordinary degree, partly because of the convergence on economic policy, and I think now what's interesting is the emergence of a green left, which is very different from both of those previous ones and picks up elements of both traditions, both left and right traditions. And what's really interesting about these new forms of deliberation, democratic innovation, and so on is it allows citizens to talk about the real issues they're concerned about in their daily lives, which they know that there is no mass party is going to pick up, that they don't have a voter affiliation, a party affiliation for life, a party card that makes it easy for them to decide who to vote for. They know it's complex. So giving them an opportunity to engage at a deeper level and with a lot more information is a way of ensuring better decisions as well as voter participation.
Fantastic. Well, one of the consequences of you being such an ill-disciplined rabble is that I have no time to do a mega wrap-up. So I'm not going to, but I think what each of you has said has been really, truly fantastic, both in terms of identifying some of the threats to democracy and some of the ways in which to address it. And I'm conscious that there are a number of questions that haven't been answered, so apologies to those who asked them. But I did like, Suzanne, in particular, what you said about, exposing the enemies of democracy, energize the allies of democracy, particularly young people. I think there's been a very strong theme around the pernicious role of social media and artificial intelligence in lending itself to abuse of elections and information sharing in ways that is very negative, and I feel we're still not quite there and trying to figure out what collectively can be done by that. But I think one thing you're all saying is energizing people around decision-making, around democratic participation is truly fundamental, and that is both the way to go, and the evidence of it happening provides hope. So really, great panel, great questions. Thank you all very much indeed.